Welcome. We're coming to a special part of the passage that we need to look at, Colossians 3, verses 18 through chapter 4, verse 1. And in this passage, what we're dealing with is what's called the household code. Paul moves from these sweeping commands that are very general, especially in verses 15 through 17, to this passage that becomes very, very specific. How does all this relate to family life? And that was very important. So it's really a logical progression in that he's moving from a general command to how does this specifically work out for a Christian in family life. Now, household codes like this one were common in the ancient world, and the New Testament contains a number of them, though not always in this length and not always addressing so many of the members of the family, but certainly we do see them elsewhere, especially in the book of Ephesians, in which we find some real similarities to what Paul says, but also some differences. For Paul, he's helping them think through new life, right? The new life that they find because of baptism. And one of the things that we need to remember in this passage is that Paul is speaking to Christians, all right? The letter is to Christians, but it cannot be assumed that they lived in households where only Christians lived. So they might be Christians who have spouses who are non-Christians. So he's writing to the Christian spouse in the church, but they may or may not have a Christian spouse. Children who could have chosen to come into the Christian community without their parents. He could certainly be talking to slaves who have non-Christian masters, and he could be talking to masters who may or may not have Christian slaves. This both explains some of the instruction that Paul gives and also complicates its application on occasion. So we'll work through some of that as we go along. What we do know is that Paul has spent all of this time talking about how Christians stand in differentiation from the culture, how Christians do not have the same ethic. Because of their relationship with Jesus Christ, they are different. And we know that he's not asking them to live like everyone else in terms of family. So we're going to jump into the passage and hear what Paul has to say to families. Paul begins by addressing wives. He says, "Wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord." Now, this is a very different picture from what we see at work in a typical Roman literature household code. The husband would have had all the control, all the power in a Roman household. He would be domineering and he would demand obedience from his wife, which his wife was required to forgive. It was all about the power of the man over the woman. In fact, Aristotle said that a man is superior and his wife is inferior. Paul's instruction is a far cry from that approach to family. In Paul's picture, what we see is the wife chooses submission without the demands of her husband. So it's not husbands make your wives submit, it's wives submit to your husband. So they have the choice to do this, and it's done as is fitting in the Lord. So there's a qualifier there. And this places some limitations on what husbands can ask wives to do, right? Or what she would be willing to do. Certainly, it's clear that Paul is not saying that a wife should intentionally sin to submit to her husband. Absolutely not. So only in what is fitting in the Lord, things that a husband asks a wife to do that are fitting, things that are fitting in general as a follower of Jesus Christ. So it's not enforced by the husband, and it is only submission in terms of what is fitting for the Lord. We also need to keep in mind that Paul covers this ground elsewhere. In Ephesians, we see this at work as well. And let's take a quick look at that. Ephesians chapter 5, we see another household code, and it begins this way with Ephesians 5:21. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And then verse 22, wives, submit to your husbands, to your own husbands, as you do to the Lord. So we see the household code in this setting in terms of and in the context of mutual submission throughout the household. So members of the household are choosing what is best for each other. That's the kind of household that Paul has in mind when he thinks about what a Christian household should look like. Now, I think that's really important because I think this is the same Paul who wrote the Ephesian letter, and so we're thinking about the same kind of approach to family. So it's not just that a husband demands obedience from his wife. In fact, Paul never says that, as the Roman household codes would have, but that the woman has a choice. She decides whether she's going to submit or not. Paul calls on her to do so, but in a way that pleases God. Plus, I think we can say that this submission is in the context of mutual submission to one another. So, a husband and wife lovingly choosing what is best for the other person. Okay, so I think that's the fullness of what Paul's doing here. So, rather than this passage being used for what we would call patriarchy, where it's all about the power of the man over the woman, this is really Paul sort of setting free what in the ancient world would have been a very strict arrangement. Now, Paul also gives instructions for husbands. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. That's verse 19. Now, again, in the ancient household codes, especially Roman household codes, what we would find is that it was just the man supposed to make the woman submit. There's nothing about husbands being called to love their wives in Roman household codes. In fact, that would have been a foreign thing. They wouldn't even thought in those terms. So this is a very different way of approaching marriage. So Christian marriage looks different from Roman cultural marriage. And it also says that husbands should not treat their wives harshly. Now, again, wives were treated very harshly throughout the ancient world, and the husband's concern here is for the welfare of his wife rather than getting what he wants from his wife. Roman household codes began with the authority of the husband. Now, Paul does not get to give that kind of authority. He rather calls the wife to submit and calls the husband to continually choose what is best for his wife. So love your wives. This is agape love, the kind of love that we've talked about before in Scripture that has to do with self-giving, self-sacrificing love. So you're talking about a husband who is willing to do whatever it takes to provide the very best things for his wife. Women will be drawn into a relationship with a husband like this, right? And submission be so much easier to a husband who has her very best interests at heart. And Paul is clear that the husband does not force his will on his wife. It is a decision that she makes. So Paul paints a relatively short but very countercultural picture of what marriage should look like. This is all in the context of choosing love and choosing submission rather than enforced power and control. So rather than sort of confirming what the culture said about marriage, Paul is standing against what the culture said about marriage. So this is very different. And in our culture, in American culture, this is still a little bit hard to hear. Women do not want to talk about submission, and I understand that because passages like this have been used to force women to submit, to encourage women to endure abuse quietly, silently, and none of that is acceptable. What Paul is saying is in terms of mutual love and care, then the husband calls himself to love his wife, and the woman then is willing to submit to his role in the marriage. Okay, that's marriage. Let's think about what Paul says to children. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Now, this certainly harkens back to the Ten Commandments, Exodus chapter 20, verse 12, which calls on children to obey their parents. The qualifier for the wife, I think, certainly fits here as well, right? Paul would not be calling children to obey their parents and in that intentionally sin. So Paul's not going to ask them to do that. I don't think that's the case. But he's saying, in what you do, this is how you obey. In everything, for this pleases the Lord. If this is about pleasing God, then it's not going to be enduring abuse. It's not going to be intentionally sinning. It's going to be obeying them as is possible and please God. So the fact that Paul even addresses children runs counterculture as well, because in many household codes in Rome, the children would not even be mentioned. We have to remember that in the ancient world, children were not valued as they are in the modern world, especially in Western culture. Children were ignored. Children were seen as property. Children, if they were unwanted, could be sent out in the desert and abandoned. This is the way that children were treated. But here, Paul addresses children and treats them as though they matter. And so he gives them at a place that is elevated over what many people in the ancient world would have given. But he doesn't leave it just for children. We see that he gives some instruction for fathers as well. Now, we said that Paul runs counterculture, and here again he does. This shocks Roman ears in the ancient world. In the ancient world, the father had absolute authority in the household. For Paul to qualify that authority in any way would have been a surprise, and Paul places some clear limits on the actions, the role of the father in this passage. Do not embitter your children. Don't bait them. Don't provoke them. Okay? Fathers are called to guide their children, right? Don't discourage them. If the father intentionally provokes his children, then they're going to be discouraged. So Paul is saying, be the kind of father that encourages your kids. Be the kind of father that lifts your kids up, that helps them to see their value in God's sight. So it's a different way of looking at what parenthood is all about. And so Paul reinvents the relationship between children and fathers. Children are seen as important, as valued in Paul's approach to the family. And he also tells fathers that it matters how you treat your kids. And for many Romans, you just did whatever you wanted. It didn't matter how you treated your kids. But Paul sees this in a very different light. So we have a different approach to marriage, and we have a very different approach to parenting as well. So Paul is painting a new picture of what Christian families look like. And we can begin to imagine how people in Colossae who were not Christians would begin to see these Christians interacting with their spouses, interacting with their kids, and wondering, why are they doing this differently? Why are they seeing these things in a different light than what we have seen them? And it would have attracted some attention, and maybe it would have caused people to want to be around these Christians and see what was different. But I think this speaks to us in our cultures as well as we think about how we interact with our spouses and interact with our children, that we need to value them, that they are important, that this is not about power structure and enforcing control or obedience. This is about mutual love and respect and kindness and showing all of those things within the family. Now, the next part is a little more foreign to most of us, thankfully, because we tend not to experience it. But it brings up a lot of questions because of our history, right? Because he's going to talk about slavery. And especially in the United States, slavery has caused such tremendous problems in our history and in our present. And the evil of the past has haunted the present and will haunt our future because of what has happened before and because of race-based slavery. Any kind of slavery is a negative. Any kind of slavery, one person owning another person, that has to come in conflict with how God created us, right? I mean, God gives us value as individuals. We matter to God. We are created in his image. How can we be created in his image and then owned by another person? So it seems to me that slavery in itself runs counter to the very nature that God has given us. But then when you take race-based slavery, insert that into a system, and see the incredible mistreatment of people in the past in American history, wow, it's all kinds of problems. And certainly Paul didn't anticipate those things. But what he did know was that there were slaves in the ancient world, and that was not going to change. And he was going to write to these slaves and tell them how to live as Christians and be slaves. Okay, now that's not a pleasant thought for us. We would rather say, you're free. Okay, and thankfully, that's what's happened in our culture eventually. But here, Paul has to deal with the reality. And the reality was some of the people in the church were going to be slaves. How did they do that? How did they survive it? How did they live in a way that pleased God? And just dealt with the fact that they were going to be slaves. So let's think about what Paul tells them in this. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. So we hear what he's saying, obey your earthly masters in everything. Now again, I think there's got to be qualifiers, just like he has on marriage. Slaves shouldn't intentionally sin, shouldn't do something that displeases God. But they had little choice in the matter. They could resist, but that was going to be unpleasant. What they had to do was obey as much as they possibly could and please God. But Paul makes the point here But this is not just about pleasing the master, this is about being the right person. And so he says to them to work in a way that honors the work and do it for God. So ultimately, the work was for God. It was being the right kind of person rather than just pleasing another person. He says, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart. That reminds us of earlier in the chapter, verses 15 through 17, where everything is for God. Work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Now, there's some important words there. First of all, Paul says, whatever you do. That does definitely remind us of 15 through 17 and the general commands that are given there. And Paul is elevating slaves here. And we say, well, how? Because they're still slaves. Well, think about it this way. He's saying your work is not because you're owned. Your work is for the Lord. You are doing this for something higher, not for your human masters. And you know you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. Now, this is where we need to know the culture. Because in ancient Roman culture, a male slave had no rights. Okay, slaves had no rights in general. But when you think about slaves who were males, they could not be considered fathers, so their children were taken away from them. They could not receive an inheritance. They were basically treated as a perpetual child with no rights, sort of as though they're the child of the master. But Paul says, you as Christians will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. So eventually, they are going to be given the honor that they deserve as human beings. It is God who is at work in them. And so they are serving the Lord Christ. So we need to remember that Paul is elevating them and saying they are of value. They matter. They have inherent value just like every other human being. So in the midst of their life as slavery, their lives as slaves, Paul is saying you still matter to God. Even though the culture may ignore you, even though the culture may say you have no rights, you can receive no inheritance, you can't serve as a father, God sees you as a person of real value and will give you the inheritance that you deserve. So Paul is saying that this looks very different in Christian eyes than it did to the rest of the world. The rest of the passage. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for their wrongs, and there is no favoritism. This seems to be slightly more general and making it clear that people who disobey are going to receive some punishment for that, right? That there's consequences for disobedience. Okay, so we've got this instruction for slaves, which we'd rather not have because we'd rather Paul say that they should all be freed. And Paul may very well have believed that, but he also knew that there was no way for him to release all the slaves who were Christians in Colossae. So he tells them this is how you can live as a slave and do so in a way that pleases God and do so in a way that has a future um, a future way of looking, a future perspective. So they're looking for the reward that comes from following Jesus. But Paul doesn't just leave it there, right? He doesn't just talk to slaves and he doesn't just say that they should obey. As always, Paul does some countercultural things. So let's see what he does. Chapter 4, verse 1, where this household code ends, Paul says, masters, provide for your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven. Now again, Roman ears would have been shocked to hear that, because no one said that a Roman slave master should give what was right and fair. That was unheard of. Okay? No one believed that. But Paul says, he's speaking to Christian masters, provide for your slaves, give them what's right and fair, treat them with respect, with kindness, provide what's needed, because you know that you have a master in heaven. None of us are masters of our own universe. Ultimately, we all serve God. And Paul is saying you as masters know that you answer to someone, and so you should treat your slaves with respect and kindness that they deserve. Okay? So this all is a countercultural way of looking at the household in the ancient world. And Paul's giving us a very different picture than what we might have seen in the ancient world. So we need to think, okay, this is the way Paul laid it out for these ancient Christians. What do we do with this? So as ever, we're going to think about how we handle the homiletics of this all, right? So what are our homiletical approaches? Well, we could approach the household code and think about family, right? In Western churches, man, if you want to get people to church, one of the best ways to do that is preach a series of sermons that's based on the needs of families. Okay, how do I live in the family setting and do it well? People are continually struggling with that. So we could talk about family. And Paul certainly gives some help here for families and paints us a picture of the way that a family should work in terms of mutual submission, mutual love, kindness, concern, rather than a power structure that's out for one person to dominate everyone else. We could also think in terms of new life. So Paul is painting this picture of what new life looks like. It is not like the life that they used to live. And so it's going to be countercultural, right? Paul is not going to say, well, just do what all the Romans do, because he's just finished saying, put off all these things that you see at work in your old self and live a new life. Well, part of that new life is this household code. So Paul's giving us a new picture here. So I think there's lots of preaching opportunities. You could do a series of sermons on the family. You could do one sermon on the family. Some people have used the passages about slavery to talk about work. I'm skeptical of doing that, very hesitant to do that, because slavery is not like work. I mean, there's work involved in slavery, but it's a very different relationship of being owned rather than choosing to receive wages for the work that we do. So I hesitate to do that. But I do think that Paul is talking about relationships and showing people the love and kindness that they all deserve. So it's a great way to think about how we interact on the basis of family. Okay, Paul gives some further instructions on the new life, and then he gives some greetings to the people in Colossae. So we've got just a couple of lectures walking through the text of Colossians left. And we'll be continuing to read, so make sure you're reading through this and making the comments on WhatsApp, and I appreciate your attention.